The snow had been falling steadily for hours, layering the suburban streets in a pristine blanket of white. The houses on Sycamore Lane were strung with lights that blinked methodically, their cheeriness exaggerated against the still black sky above. Inside one of the homes, Margaret Jenkins sat alone in her meticulously decorated living room. The space was immaculate, almost unsettlingly so, with tinsel wrapped deliberately around banisters and ornaments hung at precise intervals on the tree. Margaret had always been known for her perfectionism, the kind that edged into obsession. Her husband was working late as usual, and her teenage son was at a Christmas party across town, and she told herself she liked the solitude, but somewhere deep down a knot of unease was forming. Despite the season's forced comforts, somewhere outside the wind picked up, whistling faintly through the gaps in the window panes, and she swore she heard something else, something faint. Earlier that week, the letters had started arriving. Small, crisply folded bits of parchment tucked into her doorframe or scattered on her front porch among the falling snow. Margaret assumed they were part of some neighborhood prank, the kind of thing bored kids concocted during winter break when the thrill of freedom became monotonous. The notes were written in elegant but spidery handwriting, with phrases that seemed random at first glance. He sees you when you're sleeping. The red suit is watching. Bad kids get something worse than coal. She had flicked them into the trash without a second thought, stuffing her unease down of every chore on her endless to-do list. Tonight, however, her meticulous nature was failing her. Her eyes kept flicking to the front window, catching glimpses of shadows in the shimmering holiday lights. Maybe it was the storm bending trees or the guilt gnawing at her for snapping at her son that morning. Whatever it was, Margaret found herself glancing at the door with increasing frequency, each creak and groan of the house sharpening her awareness. A sudden thump startled her. It came from the roof. Margaret froze mid-breath, waiting, her pulse a drumbeat against her temples. It had to be snow sliding, or a bird. Did birds fly in snowstorms? She couldn't remember. Her husband always teased her about her overactive imagination, calling her paranoia creative but absurd. Gathering her resolve, Margaret stood and moved to the window, her reflection distorting in the frost-speckled glass. She squinted out at the yard but saw only the vague outline of her son's abandoned sled, half buried near the driveway, and dim lights from neighboring houses glowing through the snow. But the thump came again, louder this time, shifting directly over her. An icy dread dripped down her spine. She couldn't bring herself to investigate further, reminded instead of those chilling letters, those words she'd tried to forget. Bad kids get something worse than coal. At 11:43 p.m. sharp, Margaret's doorbell rang. The sound reverberated through the house like a scream, completely out of sync with the controlled peace of the night. She hesitated, walking slowly to the hallway. Her throat was dry, her hand cold and trembling as it hovered near the doorknob. Through the etched glass panels, she could make out the unmistakable red of someone's coat, vibrant even in the dim glow of the porch lights. Panic seized her. The doorbell rang again, a measured, deliberate tone that suggested too much patience. Against her better judgment, she peeked through the peephole, her breath hitching. The figure wasn't Santa, though it was dressed like him, red suit, white fur trim, but the face beneath the drooping hat bore an eerie mask, stretched into a broad, rictus grin. The eyes were hollow black pits, staring unblinking at her door. The figure carried a sack slung over one shoulder, but something about the way it hung, lumpy and uneven, made Margaret backpedal instinctively, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Margaret turned to run, to hide, to do anything but stand frozen in place, but she hadn't even moved before the door creaked open of its own accord. The air rushed in, icy cold and smelling faintly of pine and decay. She stared, her every nerve ending ablaze with primal fear. Nobody was there. The porch stood empty, no footprints in the freshly fallen snow, no sign of the figure she'd clearly seen. But the sack was there now, nestled at her feet. It was surprisingly small, but moved faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though something inside were struggling for breath. Her mind spiraled, every rational thought drowned beneath a rising tide of dread. Shaking, she crouched down, hesitant fingers brushing the rough burlap. As the sack quivered once more, her resolve broke. She tore it open as a muffled whimper reached her ears. Inside was her son's favorite scarf, its deep green fabric soaked in something dark and sticky. Margaret's screams echoed through the empty streets of Sycamore Lane, her silence broken just as the neighbors' holiday lights flickered and went dark.